The data slate slipped out of Jian's fingers for the third time that morning. She muttered something under her breath, something her grandmother would not have approved of, and bent to pick it up from the grating. The corridor floor on the persistent argument, a designation she had always thought sounded more like a bad marriage than a survey vessel, was perpetually damp. Condensation from the coolant pipes overhead. She had put in 4 maintenance requests in 8 months. She had received 3 automated acknowledgments and 1 cheerful suggestion that she try wiping the floor herself. The slate's corner was cracked now. Third time for that too. "You've got a 20-minute window before the Vorkai delegation boards," said a voice behind her. Ensign Tejo was leaning against the bulkhead with a protein pack halfway to his mouth, watching her with the specific expression of someone who had nowhere better to be. He was 23, had hair that refused to lie flat, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to appear exactly where he wasn't needed. "I know," Jian said. "They sent another pre-boarding transmission." "I know. It had more threat clauses than the last one." "Tejo." 11, I counted." She straightened up and tucked the cracked slate under her arm. "Lieutenant Commander Jian O, Xenolinguistics and First Contact Protocol, 7 years in deep survey, 3 commendations, 1 reprimand for arguing with a superior officer who had been, in her professional opinion, catastrophically wrong." She was 31 and had spent more hours studying species she'd never met than sleeping, and right now she had condensation on her left boot and a delegation of Vorkai dignitaries bearing down on her ship who had spent the last 6 days broadcasting, in 17 different frequencies, detailed descriptions of what they planned to do to humanity if humanity did not immediately and unconditionally surrender the Sathari corridor. The thing was, the Vorkai were not small. This was the detail that kept surfacing in the briefings, stated with an almost academic neutrality that Jian found slightly hilarious. The Vorkai are not small. Average height 4 meters, bilateral symmetry but 6 limbs, the lower 4 used for locomotion, the upper 2, the threat arms, as the early xenobiologists had cheerfully called them, capable of exerting approximately 14,000 newtons of force. Their skin was a deep blue-gray, bioluminescent along the ridgelines, which pulsed in patterns that correlated with emotional state. They smelled of copper and something floral that no one had been able to identify. They had 17 words for dominance. They had, apparently, encountered 63 spacefaring species in 300 years of expansion. Every single one of those species had surrendered within 9 days of first contact. Humanity had been contacted 41 days ago and had responded by sending a survey vessel crewed by 63 people, most of whom were scientists, to open diplomatic talks. The Vorkai, based on their transmissions, found this baffling, then insulting, then, in some register of their communication that the translation matrix was still struggling with, something that might have been unsettling. Jian thought it was kind of funny. She hadn't said this out loud yet, she was saving it. The docking bay smelled like ship grease and recycled air, and the faint metallic tang that always preceded a pressurization event. Jian stood in the reception line with Captain Boris Shin on her left, a compact woman of 50 with gray-streaked hair and an expression like carved stone, and xenobiologist Dr. Hyunwoo Jang on her right, who was so visibly excited that he kept bouncing slightly on his heels. Hyunwoo was the only person on the ship who had been actively thrilled by the threat transmissions, because threat transmissions meant the Vorkai used subordinate clauses, which he felt was linguistically fascinating. The airlock cycled. The first Vorkai who came through had to duck, and even ducking, its head nearly brushed the bay's upper struts. The bioluminescent lines along its neck and shoulders were pulsing a deep, slow red. Threat display, the briefings had noted, but also the color associated with formal declaration of intent. It wore what passed for ceremonial dress, layered fibrous garments in black and a dark silver that caught the light oddly, and its threat arms were held outward and angled downward at exactly 30 degrees, which was the posture the behavioral analysts had labeled territorial assertion, dominant class. Behind it came 5 more. They fanned out in a practiced formation, filling the docking bay in a way that was clearly deliberate, making themselves large, making the humans feel small. Jian watched Captain Shin not move a single millimeter. The lead Vorkai, the Vethkal, the first speaker, designated in the briefings as Subject V1 and informally among the crew as tallest, lowered its gaze to the humans. Its eyes were amber, the pupils vertical, and they moved with an unsettling precision, cataloging, assessing. When it spoke, the translation matrix took 0.4 seconds and then rendered, "You are the ones who did not yield. We will explain your error." Captain Shin said, "Welcome aboard the persistent argument. Can I offer you something to drink?" The Vorkai bioluminescence shifted, a flicker of something that the matrix could not immediately parse. Subject V1 said something, and the matrix took a full second this time before producing, "You offer refreshment." "We do," said Captain Shin. "Dr. O speaks your language better than the matrix. She'll be your primary contact." All 6 pairs of amber eyes moved to Jian. She smiled. She couldn't help it. It was a reflex, the expression she defaulted to under pressure, and she'd tried to train it out of herself for years and mostly failed. The Vorkai went extremely still. All of them. The bioluminescence along their ridgelines flared, briefly and sharply, through a color that wasn't in any of the behavioral analysis documents. Hyunwoo, quietly, behind her. "Oh, that's interesting." The first negotiation session lasted 4 hours and produced exactly nothing, which Jian had expected. The Vorkai's entire opening structure was built around a graduated intimidation framework. She had mapped it out from the transmissions and confirmed it now in person. They would state a demand, they would describe consequences, they would wait for a counter-demand that acknowledged their superior position, which would then allow them to make a slightly more moderate demand. It was like haggling, except the premise was that one party had already lost and was simply negotiating the terms of its own surrender. The problem was that the human delegation kept failing to acknowledge inferiority, which apparently was not in the Vorkai's negotiating script at all. "You are 63 individuals on a single vessel," Subject V1 said, through the matrix, with the careful emphasis of someone explaining something to a child. "We have committed 400 warships to this sector." "That's a significant resource allocation," said Captain Shin pleasantly. "You do not have 400 warships." "No, we don't." "Then you understand your position." "I understand you have 400 warships in this sector," said Captain Shin. "What I'm less clear on is what you want to do with the Sathari corridor specifically. Maybe we could talk about that." The bioluminescence rippled. Jian was watching it carefully, cross-referencing with her notes. Threat red had faded slightly. There was something new threading through it, a pale gold she hadn't seen in any of the recordings. She wrote gold, confusion, recalculation, in her margin and kept watching. After the session, walking back through the corridor to the linguist's workroom, which was generously titled, being approximately the size of a large closet, Hyunwoo fell into step beside her. "The gold," he said immediately. "I know. It's not in the behavioral literature." "I know. Do you think it's because we're not acting scared?" Jian sat down at her desk and pulled up the session recording. "Yeah, I think so." She watched the footage back at half speed. The gold had first appeared, she found it now, frame by frame, not when Captain Shin had refused to acknowledge their superior position. It had appeared when Jian smiled. She sat with that for a moment. "Great," she thought. "I accidentally invented a new Vorkai emotional state." The Vorkai delegation stayed 3 days. This was itself unprecedented. In all 63 prior contact events, the Vorkai had completed their operations within 48 hours. Board, display, receive surrender, leave. They had apparently never had a reason to stay longer. The ship adapted around them in the way that ships adapt around anything, with mild chaos, a lot of improvised engineering, and a collective decision to simply get used to it. The Vorkai were too tall for most doorways and had to fold themselves to move through corridors, which gave them a slightly ungainly look that Jian suspected they found deeply undignified. The crew learned quickly to press against walls when they approached. The Vorkai, for their part, moved with extraordinary care, which she found interesting. She had expected carelessness, the contempt of the powerful toward the small. Instead, they were almost precise, folding their 6 limbs in tight and walking with a measured delicacy through spaces not built for them. On the second day, she found Subject 5-1 in the observation lounge. She almost didn't go in. The Vorkai had been allocated specific areas of the ship, and the lounge wasn't one of them, but the observation lounge had the best view, and she'd had a 15-hour session with the translation matrix, and she needed 5 minutes of stars. So she hesitated at the door for a moment, then went in anyway, because she was tired enough to be brave. V1 was standing at the viewport, all four locomotion limbs on the floor, threat arms folded behind it. A posture she hadn't seen before. Not a formal posture. Its bioluminescence was quiet, very slow. A low blue she had tentatively labeled as either contemplative or digestive, though she was hoping for the former. She sat down in the chair furthest from it and didn't say anything. For a while, neither of them spoke. The stars outside did what stars did, stayed put, indifferent and bright. Then V1 said, in its own language, without the matrix, in a pattern she recognized as informal register, "This view is the same everywhere." Jian considered that. In Vorkai, she said, "The stars?" A pause. The bioluminescence flickered. "You speak without the machine." "Badly," she said. "My grammar is probably terrible." "It is," said V1. There was something in the rhythm of it that her pattern recognition flagged as possibly, dry. "Why do you know our language?" "It's my job." "No one has learned our language in 300 years. She thought about that. "Did anyone try?" The silence stretched longer this time. V1's bioluminescence shifted through that pale gold again, there and gone. "No," it said finally. Jian looked out at the stars and didn't say anything else, because sometimes the best linguistic move was to leave space. That was something her first mentor had told her, back when she was 22 and convinced that every silence needed filling. "Leave space," he'd said. "The most important conversations happen in the pauses." V1 said, in a quieter pattern, "What is your designation?" "Jian," she said. It tried the syllables, got them about 80% right. She did not correct it because 80% was a significant effort for a species that had never needed to approximate human phonemes before. She said, "Yours?" Another long pause, then, "Vareth." Not subject V1, not the Veth call. Vareth. She filed that away and kept looking at the stars. The third day began with a crisis. The crisis was this. Someone on the crew, Teho as it turned out, because of course it was Teho, had given one of the junior Vorkai delegates a cup of coffee. This had happened because Teho had been eating breakfast in the commissary, and one of the delegates had been walking past, and Teho, operating on about 4 hours of sleep and his own particular social instincts, had held the cup up and said, "Want some?" in the tone he used for literally everyone and everything. The delegate had accepted it. This was, apparently, a massive violation of something. Jian got paged to the forward meeting room at 0600 to find Vareth. She could no longer think of it as V1. Standing with its threat arms held in a configuration she had never seen before, the bioluminescence blazing a deep, saturated red that was so intense it was casting actual light on the walls, and 3 of the other delegates in similar states, and Teho standing in the middle of all of this, holding his own coffee cup looking genuinely confused. "What happened?" Jian asked. "I offered him a coffee," Teho said. He gestured at the delegate in question, who was the smallest of the 6, still 3.5 meters, bioluminescence cycling rapidly. He looked interested. I said, "Want some?" He said. Teho made a gesture that approximated the delegate's response, which had apparently been a complex series of postures. "I thought that meant yes." "It did mean yes," Jian said, because she'd studied enough of the behavioral literature to recognize acquiescence posture. She turned to Vareth and switched to Vorkai. "What is the error?" Vareth's response came fast and formal, and she had to ask it to slow down twice. The short version, as far as she could parse it, in Vorkai culture, accepting food or drink from someone below your status was a declaration of acknowledged dependency. It was used in specific ritual contexts. The junior delegate had, from the Vorkai perspective, just publicly declared that it was placing itself in a dependency relationship with a human. Specifically with Teho, who was an ensign and 23 years old and had crumbs on his uniform. Jian stood very still for a moment, working through the implications. Then she said, in Vorkai, carefully, "In human culture, sharing food is how you say, 'You matter to me. You are welcome here.'" Vareth stared at her. The deep red flickered. "There is no hierarchy in this?" "No," she said. "My captain would offer you the same cup." The bioluminescence cycled for a long time. The other delegates were watching Vareth. The red faded slowly, degree by degree, replaced by something quieter, something that moved in longer, slower waves. She had no word for it yet. She wrote it in her mental notes as reconsideration and kept her face neutral. The young one, Vareth said finally, nodding toward Tejo. He knew none of this. No, she said. He was just being friendly. Another long pause. Then Vareth said something that the Matrix, which she'd quietly reactivated, rendered as friendly, with a question mark attached, as though the concept required special handling. She found out later, much later, from Vareth directly, that the Vorkai word she'd come closest to in that moment was Vel-Sathri. It meant approximately the quality of extending trust without evidence that trust is warranted. It was considered, in Vorkai culture, either a form of profound stupidity or a form of spiritual achievement. The distinction depended on context. Humanity, Vareth told her, was the first species in 300 years of contact that had demonstrated Vel-Sathri in large quantities toward the Vorkai. Every other species had been afraid. We made them afraid, Vareth said, on the third evening, after the crisis had de-escalated, and Tejo had been formally introduced to the junior delegate, whose name, Jian had discovered, was Savari, as someone of equivalent status to a young warrior, which Tejo had accepted with the same easy nod he accepted everything. They were sitting in the observation lounge again. Jian had brought tea this time. She'd offered some to Vareth with full awareness of the cultural weight of the gesture, and watched the slow gold flicker across its ridgelines as it accepted. I know, she said. We intend to make you afraid. I know. Why aren't you? She considered the question honestly. It deserved honesty. We are, a little, she said. 400 warships is a lot of warships. My captain isn't sleeping much. But you smile. She thought about this. How to explain something that felt instinctive. When humans are nervous, she said slowly, working in Vorkai with the shape of it, we sometimes laugh, or smile. It doesn't mean we're not scared, it means we're still here. We haven't disappeared into the fear. Vareth looked at her for a long time. The bioluminescence was that slow blue again. The first time you smiled at me, it said, in the docking bay. You all stopped moving. We didn't know what it meant. What did you think it meant? A pause that she was learning to read as genuine contemplation rather than hesitation. We thought maybe it was a display of threat. Humans show teeth. Some species do this when they're about to attack? Yes, she started laughing. She couldn't help it. The image of herself, 5 feet 4 inches, cracked data slate under her arm, being read as a threat by a 4-meter bioluminescent apex predator. The laugh came out involuntary and slightly too loud in the quiet lounge. Vareth went very still again. Then, slowly, something happened to its face that she had no reference for. Its expression wasn't built like a human expression. The musculature was different, the features worked differently. But something around the outer edges of its eyes shifted, something relaxed, and the gold in its bioluminescence spread wider than she'd ever seen it. She thought, oh. She thought, that's the Vorkai equivalent of a smile. She thought, a few seconds after that, in the careful corner of her mind where she kept things she wasn't ready to say out loud, I'm in trouble. The negotiations continued. They were not simple. The Sethari corridor was genuinely valuable, resource-dense, strategically positioned, and both humanity and the Vorkai had legitimate claims to sectors within it. The Vorkai's standard operating procedure was total cession, and the human diplomatic position was shared access with defined zones, which were not the same thing. There were 3 sessions where Jian was fairly certain the talks were going to collapse. One where Captain Shin asked her quietly, after, whether she thought the Vorkai were bluffing about the warships. No, she said. Okay. Shin was quiet for a moment. Are they actually going to use them? I don't think they know yet, Jian said. I think we've confused them. That's reassuring. I mean it seriously. They've never had to improvise in a first contact before. Every variable they planned for assumed we'd respond with fear. We didn't. They're recalculating. Shin looked at her steadily. And you think that works in our favor? I think it gives us time, Jian said. What we do with the time is our problem. She was having another problem, which she was keeping separate from the professional one, because she was an adult and a trained diplomat, and it was completely inappropriate. The problem was that she'd started looking forward to the evenings in the observation lounge. She'd started noticing things, the way Vareth held its teacup, with surprising delicacy, one clawed finger hooked through the handle. The way it asked questions, the way those questions were always slightly unexpected. It had asked her once about human music, which wasn't in any cultural briefing. It had asked why humans made things that served no survival purpose, which was a question she'd thought about seriously and given a serious answer to, and Vareth had been quiet for a long time after. She told herself this was professional investment, xenolinguistic relationship building, entirely within the scope of her role. She was lying to herself and she knew it, but she was busy, so she filed it for later. Later arrived, as it always did, inconveniently, the third week of negotiations. Jian was in her workroom at 0200, which was where she was most nights, and she was going through recordings of session 8 when the door chimed. She assumed it was Taeho. He had developed a habit of checking on her with protein packs at odd hours, which was irritating and also the reason she hadn't fallen over yet from malnutrition. It wasn't Taeho. Vareth had to fold itself almost double to get through the doorway. The workroom, which was small under normal circumstances, became approximately the size of a closet with it inside. There was one chair. Jian was sitting in it. Vareth simply lowered itself to the floor, which it did with a grace that suggested this was not uncomfortable, and looked at her. The bioluminescence was the quiet blue, but there was gold threading through it in slow pulses. "Something wrong?" she asked, in Vorkai. "We received communication from the Home Command," it said. "They want resolution within 6 days." She felt the familiar drop in her stomach. Or the warship's move. She pulled up her data slate, the cracked one, she'd never replaced it, and started making notes because making notes was what she did when she needed her hands to be doing something. "Okay, that's workable. We've been making progress on the zone delineations. Jian." She stopped. It had never used her name in a direct address. Vorkai syntax placed names differently, at the end or embedded in formal structures. This was a direct address, personal register. She'd only heard it used between Vorkai delegates when they thought she wasn't listening. "I told them," Vareth said slowly, "that resolution was close, that the humans were not what was expected." "What did they say?" "They said that was not relevant. 63 species yielded. 64 will yield." She put the slate down. "What do you think?" A very long pause, long enough that she watched the bioluminescence cycle through 3 different colors, none of which she had a word for. "I think," Vareth said carefully, "that you are the first species I have wanted to understand, rather than overcome." She was quiet. "In 300 years," it continued, and there was something in the pattern of it that she recognized, purely from the structure of the vowels, as something that costs something to say. "I have spoken the home language with no other species. I have not—" It paused, recalculated. "I have not sat in a small room at the second dark hour and talked about music." Vareth. "I don't know the Vorkai word for what this is," it said. "That is unusual. I know most words." She should say something professionally appropriate. She should reframe this in diplomatic terms, establish boundaries, think about the 41 days and the 400 warships and the 6 days remaining and the 63 species that had all found it easier to simply yield. What she said was, "I think I might know the human word for it." The gold in its bioluminescence spread and held, steadier than she'd ever seen it. "Tell me," it said. She looked at it. At Vareth. All 4 meters of it folded into her tiny workroom, holding a teacup that looked absurd in its clawed hand, watching her with amber eyes that had stopped cataloging and started simply seeing. And she thought about Velsathri, about extending trust without evidence, about what her grandmother had said about bravery being mostly just doing the thing before the fear finished forming. "We call it falling," she said. "It means you weren't prepared for it, and it means you don't entirely mind." The silence afterward was the good kind, the kind her mentor had meant. The Sathari Corridor Agreement was signed 11 days later, 5 days past the deadline the Home Command had set, with a 2-day extension that Vareth had negotiated internally in a series of transmissions that the human crew were not privy to. The terms were shared access with defined zones, not a human capitulation, not a Vorkai victory. Something that hadn't existed in Vorkai diplomacy before. A genuine compromise. The xenopolitics community lost its mind. There were papers published within weeks. One described it as the first asymmetric diplomatic outcome in Vorkai recorded history. Jian read it, thought asymmetric is doing a lot of work there, and filed it without comment. The delegation departed. This was protocol. This was necessary. Jian understood this. She stood in the docking bay as the Vorkai filed back to their ship. Savari paused beside Teho and did something with its threat arms, a gesture that Jian recognized as recognition between equals. And Teho, because he was Teho, said, "Same to you, man," and bumped his fist gently against the nearest available limb, which made Savari's bioluminescence flash a startled, delighted yellow. Vareth was last. It stopped in front of her. The docking bay was the same as the first day. Same smell, same condensation on the floor, same recycled air. But the bioluminescence wasn't deep threat red now. It was that steady gold she'd come to know, moving in slow, deliberate pulses. It said, in Vorkai, quietly enough that the Matrix probably didn't catch it, "The Vorkai expansion has a permanent diplomatic liaison post. It has never been filled by a non-Vorkai. There is a process to create exceptions." She looked up at it. 4 meters, amber eyes, the smell of copper and something floral she still couldn't identify. "Is that an official inquiry?" she asked. "It is whatever you need it to be," said Vareth. She thought about her cracked data slate, the damp corridor floor, the 4 maintenance requests, the 14-hour sessions with the translation matrix. She thought about the observation lounge and the quiet blue of contemplation and teacups that looked absurd in enormous clawed hands. She thought about being read as a threat because she'd smiled. She smiled now, wide and involuntary and entirely unprofessional. The gold in Vareth's bioluminescence blazed. "I'll need to file a transfer request," she said. "The paperwork is terrible." "I will wait," Vareth said. And the way it said it, in that quiet, formal register that wasn't formal at all, meant not just, "I will wait for the paperwork." In Vorkai, that construction meant, "I have already decided. However long, I will wait." She understood. She'd spent 7 years learning how to listen. Teho, at her elbow, said under his breath, "Did you just get a job offer or a marriage proposal?" "I have no idea," she said honestly. "Both, I think." "Cool," he said, and went back to talking to Savari. The persistent argument held station in the Sathari corridor for 3 more days while Captain Shin filed reports, and the diplomatic corps scrambled to understand what had just happened. Jian spent most of that time in her workroom, not sleeping, drafting her transfer request, and also a comprehensive linguistic analysis of Vorkai's emotional register that she suspected would be her most cited paper by a significant margin. On the last night, she went to the observation lounge alone. The stars outside were the same as always, indifferent, bright. She thought about 63 species that had looked at the Vorkai and seen the warships and the 4 meters and the 14,000 newtons and decided that fear was the only reasonable response. She thought about Teho, half asleep, holding out a coffee cup. She thought about how the first thing humanity had apparently done, confronted with something designed to inspire terror, was try to figure out what it was thinking, what it wanted, whether it had a name. It wasn't bravery exactly. It wasn't that they weren't afraid. It was something else, something she'd tried to explain to Vareth and kept finding new ways to say. A refusal to let the fear be the only thing. A reaching toward, even when logic said to reach away. Velsathri, she thought. We've had it the whole time. We just didn't have a word for it. She pulled out the cracked data slate and started writing. The condensation from the overhead pipe dripped onto her shoulder, same as always. She didn't bother moving. Outside, the stars held their positions, and somewhere past the edge of sensor range, 400 Vorkai warships were turning, slowly, toward home. Not in defeat, not in victory, in something new, something without a name yet in either language, which meant someone was going to have to invent one. Jian was pretty good at that. She kept writing.